Eminent Domain is a 2 to 4 player game set in space in which players will be attempting to expand their galactic empires by colonising or conquering planets. Now, the side of the box says that Eminent Domain is a deck building strategy game, and I would certainly agree that the game is strategic. There are plenty of different paths for the players to explore, but I would be hesitant to categorise this game as a deck building game. Now, to be sure, the game definitely does involve deck building, but it also incorporates resource management and role selection with the following ability. And I think that the attention of the players playing the game will be equally split between the various mechanics involved. Not one of those mechanics seems to define what this game is. So I just think calling this game a deck building game doesn't quite do it justice. It's more than that. It could almost create a new genre of games with the way it works. So if you're not a fan of deck building games, definitely stay tuned. You may still like this game. And if you are a fan of deck building games, again, stay tuned, because I really think Eminent Domain is worth looking into. So with that said, let's have a look at it. Eminent Domain is predominantly a card game. Players throughout the game will have access to 3 different types of cards: planet cards, technology cards, and role cards. The technology cards are cards that players will get throughout the game, with some limitations in place as to which ones they'll have access to. These cards will give a benefit of some sort to the players that obtain them. They usually offer more efficient actions to those that are provided on the cards that are located on the central display board, which the central display is home to the cards that play the biggest part in the game, and these cards are called role cards. Now, there are a total of 5 decks of role cards. All of the cards in the individual decks are exactly the same. There is a deck of research cards, survey cards, warfare cards, colonize cards, and produce or trade cards. To start the game, players will each begin with a 10-card deck made up of these role cards. Players will draw a hand of 5 of these cards, and the remaining 5 cards will make up their personal draw decks. This draw deck will grow throughout the game. I'll touch briefly on each of these role cards and how they work, but before I do that, there are some things that the role cards all have in common. They each have an icon, an action, and a role associated with them. In a typical player's turn, they will do the following things. They may play a card from their hand to activate its action. They must then select a role card from the central display and activate its role action. Then there is a simple cleanup phase. The role cards have different text for the different phases. If I used this card in the action phase, I'd do what it says on this section of the card. If I used it in the role phase, I'd do the role action listed here. So with that said, we'll start with the research card and have a closer look at why players would want to use this card. If you play this card from your hand in the action phase, you can discard 2 cards from your hand permanently from the game. You may want to do this at times because not all of the cards that you draft into your deck you'll want showing up all the time. So this helps you manage your deck size and what cards are actually in it in the first place. Any card used in the action phase will then be put in your personal discard pile. And note, cards played in the action phase come from your hand of cards. If this card was selected in the role phase, however, the player could draft a technology card of their choosing, for a cost of course. They then place the new tech card into their hand, not into their discard pile, so they will be able to play the new tech card in their following turn if they wish. Now, I have to mention this. The main difference between the role action and the standard actions taken in the action phase is that the player does not play a role card from their hand in the role phase. During the role phase, they select the role card they wish to activate from the cards on the central display. They then place that role card into their discard pile after activating its effect. So you'll be drafting quite a lot of these role cards during the course of the game. Now this means you will nearly always have access to whatever role you wish to use, because they are located on the display, but you may be hesitant to select a particular role at times because another player may benefit more from your selection. You see, when you select a role card, the other players can do what's called following. This means they also get to do a role action that is associated with that card, that is if they have the cards or the ability to do so. Now, if a player happens to choose not to follow another player's role selection, or simply cannot do it, they draw another card from their personal draw deck and place it into their hand. This means even in your opponent's turns, you may have a decision to make as to whether to follow or not. Now that I've covered how the roll phase differs from the action phase, I'll return to covering the other roll cards and their actions and roll actions. Okay, so next we have the survey cards. As an action, so when the card is played from your hand of cards, this card allows you to draw another 2 cards from your draw deck. If at any time in the game your draw deck is completely exhausted, you then shuffle your discard pile to create a new draw deck. This is of course the deck building coming into effect. The roll action associated with the survey card allows you to draw cards from the planet deck. How many cards can you draw? Well, here is another interesting aspect. The amount of cards you draw is dependent on how many cards you play from your hand for the use of their icons. So if I selected the survey roll, I would take the card from the central display, place it into my discard pile, then I can play more survey cards from my hand for the use of their icons to draw more planet cards. Here I add 2 survey cards from my hand and draw a total of 3 planet cards. Now, I only get to keep one of these planet cards, but I do get to see 3 of them and choose which one to keep. I then place the planet I select face down in front of me where it will remain. At this point, the planet is not yet under my control. I'll talk a little more about planets and how they work a little later on. Remember though, as with all rolls, when selected, the other players can follow if they have the ability to do so. Next we have the warfare cards. The action from this card allows you to attack a planet card in front of you, or collect a fighter and place it into your personal supply. The warfare roll, if selected during the roll phase, allows you to collect 1 fighter for each warfare symbol played from your hand. So much like the survey roll, you can play cards from your hand for their fighter icons to get more than just 1 fighter in this phase. The other roll action the active player can do is to attack a planet. To attack a planet, the player simply discards an amount of fighter tokens stated on the planet card itself. If they do this, they have successfully conquered that planet and it is converted to their control. So, to represent that, they flip the planet card over to its other side. Another roll card that will allow you to take control of planets is a colonize card. This card, when played as an action, allows you to settle a planet or place a colony. Placing a colony actually means placing the played colonize card on a planet. The roll action associated with this card allows you to place more than 1 colony by again playing cards from your hand that display the colonize icon. Instead of adding colonies in the roll phase, the active player may instead choose to settle a planet, which basically means once a planet has an amount of colonize icons on it equal to the number listed on the planet card, they can flip the card over and take control of the planet in the same way as if they had taken it by warfare. So there are 2 ways to control planets, with colonies or with warfare. Now going back for a moment, the reason the surveying roll is so handy is because you can pick and choose which planets you add to your playing area. This is important because not all planets are alike. Some planets have an ability to produce resources. Some display a permanent icon, which is very handy. Some planets are easier to colonize, some are easier to conquer, and all planets once in your control will be worth victory points at the end of the game. However, their victory point worth differs. I'll now touch base on Produce and Trade, which is a last roll card, and I'll just quickly gloss over this one because I don't want this overview to drag on. This card can either produce or trade but cannot do both, so you have to choose between the 2 options. Producing allows you to place a wooden token, or maybe even more than 1 wooden token, on an appropriate controlled planet to show that that planet has resources available. Trade, if selected, allows you to trade in a resource, or maybe even resources, for victory point tokens. Although, like the other roles in the game, players can elect to follow, and trust me, if your opponent is sitting opposite you with a bunch of resources on his planets ready for trade, you'll think twice about selecting trade as a role and will likely wait for the opportunity to play it as an action instead. Because remember, he can follow with the trade role, but he cannot follow a trade if it's played as an action. So that's the basics of the game anyway. The cleanup phase is the last part of a player's turn, and it's very simple. During this phase, the player can discard any cards from their hand and redraw up to their hand limit, which will usually be 5 cards. Unlike Dominion and some other deck building games, and this is important, you do not discard all cards in your hand during cleanup, only those that you select. This gives you more control over building a useful hand of cards for the following turn. Players will continue drafting cards, developing technologies, trading resources, and taking over planets until either a certain amount of role card decks on the central display are exhausted, or until the victory point tokens are all used up from trading resources. Then, of course, the player with the most victory points will be the winner. As a reminder, planets are worth victory points, traded resources are worth victory points, and some more advanced technology cards may also be worth victory points. So Eminent Domain took me by surprise. Turns out that it plays nothing like I thought it would. The deck building element is certainly there, but with enough differences that this game feels very unique and in no way feels like a Dominion knockoff. Also, to give you an idea about those technology cards, I recently played a 2-player game of this where I didn't draft a single technology card into my deck, and my opponent had many of them in his deck. The final score for that game was 35 points to 45 points. Whilst I did lose the game, it was certainly not a far-fetched reality that a win could be achieved by not using any technology cards. From my experiences with this game, it seems to be quite balanced even when players have gone down completely different paths. My favourite feature of Eminent Domain though is definitely the ability to follow the roles your opponents select. This keeps all of the players engaged in the game even in their opponent's turns. The choice of whether to follow or not can also be a tough one. If you do follow a role, it is likely you'll have to play cards from your hand to do so. And as a result, when your own turn comes around, you'll start with fewer cards in your hand and therefore fewer options. If you choose not to follow, however, you will start your hand with more cards and therefore more options. So there are certainly going to be times where choosing whether to follow or not is going to be a tough choice. This is not the kind of game where players are going to be at each other's throats, attacking each other and so forth. But if it were, I would be referring to Eminent Domain as Twilight Imperium the card game. But in Eminent Domain, you cannot attack your opponent in any way, shape or form. You cannot colonize or conquer their planets, make them discard any cards, or there's nothing like that. But with that said, it's not really a multiplayer solitaire experience either. You do interact with the other players, just in a very indirect kind of way. Now that might sound a bit strange to a few people out there, but because of the role cards and the following ability, you'll always be watching what the other players are doing, and in some cases, what your opponents are doing may directly affect what you choose to do in your own turn. So there is a bit of interaction in that way between the players. Now, Eminent Domain, it may take new players to the game a full playthrough just to understand how the mechanics work together. But overall, I wouldn't consider this to be a very complex game in terms of rules. It's not very hard to introduce to new players. It just might take a bit of time for all the pieces of the puzzle to fall into place, so to speak. I also have to mention it's a very, very good 2-player game. I would even go as far as saying that this is worth looking into even if you only ever played it with 2 players. I haven't played it with 3 yet, but with 4 players it's also a really good game. It's a pretty deep game, there are strategies to work on, it has good replayability, and with a playtime of 45 to 60 minutes, so far getting this to the table hasn't been much of a problem for me. So Eminent Domain, I very much enjoyed the game, thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon.